Today, we are going to discuss the impact that women's suffrage had on electoral politics worldwide. But before we delve into this topic, what we are going to try and understand is why the powers that be, or the elite, wanted to extend franchise rights to the majority of the marginalized population, in spite of knowing that it could threaten their privileges as well as their power. It is important for us to understand this aspect because if we do not do so, it will be difficult for us to understand why women as a marginalized group within society were extended the franchise right from the end of the 19th century to after the Second World War. I would begin by quoting Earl Grey, the Whig Prime Minister of Great Britain, who was elected in 1830. He is known for introducing certain electoral reforms which were not liked by most of his adversaries, especially the ones within the Tory group. He faced many an accusation, and he replied by stating that the principle of my reform is to preserve and not to change. What he meant was that if voting rights were not extended to a particular percentage of the working class male in Great Britain, then it could create a potential situation of rebellion which could have more disastrous consequences. What is interesting for us to note here is that reforms are not always introduced to change society for better. Reforms are often introduced to preserve the order. When do the elite introduce reforms? The elite introduce either economic changes or social changes so as to garner votes, support, or to preserve their property. Thus, when representative governments were first established in the United Kingdom, in the USA, in France, in Spain, and in the Latin American countries, it was done mostly to preserve the propertied class as well as their property from the have-nots. In other words, these changes were introduced to protect the propertied from the poor. As a result, franchise rights were limited mostly to the wealthy male in all of these countries. It did not extend to the working class male, let alone the working class female. But things started changing from the middle of the 19th century when the propertied class came to be divided into two different groups. While we had industrialists among these people, we also had the land-owning agriculturalist. And while one group wanted to introduce changes in the legislation process so as to bring about more industrialization, the agricultural group wanted certain legislations in order to protect their land. Therefore, working class men were included within the suffrage scope along with the agricultural worker. However, there is a little difference that we see in the newly independent colonies. The newly independent countries began by granting suffrage rights not only to the male population but also to the female population. Somewhere we can see that the question of the woman's right to vote was contained within the national freedom movements. One of the biggest examples is that of our own country, India, where women here did not have to participate or did not have to lead a rebellion to gain voting rights. As of early 1900, New Zealand had established full universal suffrage, and 17 other nations had established at least partial suffrage for its male population. Nevertheless, the other countries followed suit only after the Second World War had ended. Now the question that we raise here is that why would the people who monopolize power want to share it with those who don't? In other words, why would the elite want to share their privileges or their voting rights with the marginalized poor group? This question can have several answers. The first model that we are going to talk about was developed by John Freeman and Duncan Sniddle. It was a model which stated that the elites would extend franchise only when they felt threatened or when they felt that the democracy that they had established was lacking legitimacy. In turn, John Conley and Akram Temini argued that extension of franchise meant that there is a potential contradiction or a potential situation of conflict between the haves and the have-nots, or the enfranchised and the disenfranchised. The disenfranchised group majorly comprised of the working class, and given the new millennium of industrial revolution, whereby not only economic but many social and political changes had occurred in Europe, it was extremely important for the elitist class to ensure that no rebellion broke out. This was required to maintain the status quo. Thus, the generic argument that can be stated is as follows. Being excluded is a source of deprivation of some kind. At some time, the excluded threaten to rebel, whereby the established order is under threat. Although sharing political rights may mean compromising on certain privileges and powers by the elites, they would rather do so than risk a rebellion. Once the have-nots or the disenfranchised group has been given the suffrage right, they can potentially use the resources or the opportunities provided within the system to become a part of the system. In this way, the elites can appropriate a major part of the population, whereby a greater threat comes under control. This general argument can be turned on its head, whereby we can say that at certain times economic concessions are extended by the elites when they are faced with a great threat of rebellion. Many a times these economic concessions are introduced to ensure that political changes do not have to be brought about. What we mean to say here is that if the elite feel threatened, or if the elite see that their property is under threat and that they can be pushed to the periphery of a society which they dominate or which they have created, they will introduce certain short-term reforms which would keep the marginalized group happy. Nevertheless, if the threat is of a temporary nature and only due to certain transient circumstances, then the promise made by the elite that they would maintain the concessions even when the threat has passed is not credible to the masses. They would anyway revolt. In these circumstances, the only way left to the elite is to change the identity of the revolutionaries, and they can only do so by extending voting rights to them and bringing them within the political process. Thus, suffrage extensions are to be expected when the elite face sporadic outbursts of rebellions. So what does the elite do in such circumstances? Let us take the example of 19th century England. Following the Industrial Revolution, the cities in England had suddenly become extremely big, not in terms of facilities or housing, rather in terms of the population. Many of the rural people started moving into the cities in order to find work in the upcoming factories. This led to a problem in housing, in sanitation, in roadways, and in general health of the working class. If the government of England at that point of time had provided certain concessions in the form of better roadways or better health facilities or better housing or better sanitation, perhaps the working class woman who was a victim of not only her personal space but also the new emerging capitalist scenario would not have thought about franchise rights. Perhaps if our condition in the temporary period had been improved, women in England would not have taken militant paths to attain franchise rights. Another possible situation of extending franchise rights can be when a war is looming large over a country. Now, this argument can be explained better if we try and understand the First World War scenario, whereby most of the men had to go to the war front and women had to take up jobs that were traditionally considered to be masculine. In such a situation, the elites would have to extend certain SOPs, and they would even have to maintain it so as to ensure that the population would be in their favor and would support their war efforts. This argument is quite dated and can be traced back to Machiavelli, who had stated in his discourses that governments must extend benefits to the people in anticipation of a war. Once an enemy is at your gates, then providing concessions would not make your population happy. For the people as a whole will consider that they owe their benefits to your enemies and not to your intentions. And since they cannot but fear that when the need has passed, you may deprive them of what you have granted, they will not remain loyal to you. Thus, the justification for extending suffrage in terms of conscription is an old one. In fact, in the early 20th century, a slogan had become famous in Sweden: "One vote, one man, one gun." Finally, another reason that can be attributed to the extension of suffrage can be stated to be a divided elite. That is, when various groups within the elite contend among each other for certain privileges as well as certain advantages. This has been mentioned earlier, whereby perhaps an industrial elitist group would try and extend franchise to working class men, while the landed elite would try and extend franchise rights to the agricultural laborer so as to ensure a balance of power. While some early constitutions made suffrage universal as far as the men were concerned, It was limited in other countries to only the propertied men, that is, the men who earned or paid taxes or were not dependent on others, but the only ones who were allowed to vote. In this context, we can say that women were naturally excluded because just like children, they were not considered independent, and it was stated that giving them the right to vote would only mean doubling the votes of their male family members. The fact that women could not vote was so obvious to the founders of the representative forms of government that they actually never explicitly mentioned that women were excluded. This led to certain curious consequences in late 19th century and early 20th century. In the United States of America, women continued to vote till 1807 because it was never mentioned in their constitution that they were excluded. This was termed as an error of words. Again, the same occurred in France, where Madame Barberouche claimed the right to vote, pointing out that toute Francaise, which means that women of France had the right to vote, was contained within the constitution. Only a ruling of 1885 decided that Francaise did not extend franchise to its women, which means that France did not enfranchise its women. Nevertheless, after the Second World War, it was obvious that women, along with men, would now be given the right to vote. This was because women had participated in the war efforts not in their capacity as homemakers only. They were now working in the factories, whereby they had to take on the male-oriented roles. In this context, the cultural icon of America, that is Rosie the Riveter, had become famous. After the war ended, to push these women back into their private space and to take away their right to the political process could have actually churned out results which the government was in no position to handle. Also, by the end of the Second World War, the women's suffragist movement had become international in character. If we take up the case of United Kingdom or USA, we can see here that women had taken a militant, a proactive, and had initiated reforms for the sake of reforms. But elsewhere, in the other European nations, reforms for women, especially their right to vote, was introduced as a result of a social change that had occurred. Now, what was this change made the government enlist women as voters as well? One of the major changes was that women were no longer confined to their private space. They were not simply homemakers or mothers or nurturers. They were now moving out of their private space to find work, often in an economy which had become highly competitive, whereby a man was not the only person in the family who brought the bacon home. Once women started participating in the economic process, they started becoming acutely aware of the inequality that existed within society. Be it unequal pay, or be it gender oppression, or be it the glass ceiling effect, women needed change, and that could only be brought about by participating in the electoral process in a proactive manner. This brought about many changes in the political process of Europe, of USA, and also of the third world countries. Curiously enough, in the third world countries, many of which attained freedom much after the Second World War, women did not have to actually struggle for their voting rights. As mentioned earlier, India is one of the countries which introduced universal suffrage as soon as it had attained freedom. Similarly, in Latin America, franchise rights were extended to women by the governments in power or by those who expected to be in power so that they could push their personal policies through the legislative process. For almost a century after the suffragist movement became active, voting rights were secured along the lines of class distinction. Until well into the middle of the 20th century, the poorer classes pushed their way into the electoral process so as to initiate reforms and legislations that would go a long way in improving their position in society. The various political parties also sought their support because that would mean more votes, more economic as well as political power. While women suffragists may have been instrumental in securing voting rights in United Kingdom and USA, elsewhere this was not the case. Women were enfranchised because they were not seen as an oppressed gender, because they were merely seen as a number by the various political parties. Nevertheless, once women entered into the electoral process, many changes were brought about. Because they were not content with only voting, now they were bent about in bringing about positive changes that would, in the long term, establish an egalitarian society.